Hi, Bio20. Chapter 1.2 is about energy pyramids, and you know that ecology is the study of ecosystems, which is the living and non-living organ factors in an area, and the living is, of course, anything from bacteria, plants, algae, fungi, and the non-living that interact with them. The abiotic factors would be things like the water, the rock, the soil, the wind, the air, climate. The trophic levels, feeding levels, we're going to talk about in our topic. And when we look at a food chain, one thing that we always see that we start off with is some producer. And in the ocean, it might be plankton. On terrestrial ecosystems, it would be all the plants that are then eaten by your primary consumers. And whenever you see these arrows, remember that the arrow means is eaten by. So no matter if you're looking at a food web that is organisms that you don't recognize, you can always follow the arrow and know that is eaten by wherever the arrow is headed. So here the grasshopper is eaten by this mouse. So this primary consumer is eaten by the secondary consumer, which is eaten by the tertiary consumer, which is eaten by the quaternary consumer. So we can talk about a food chain in terms of these whether they're producers or consumers. So this is producer here, and all of these are consumers. We can also talk about it in terms of trophic levels. And remember that the sun is not the trophic level, the first organism is. So the first trophic level would be that producer, and then it goes second, third, fourth, fifth trophic level. So levels from the sun is trophic levels, whereas producers and consumers, you'd have a producer first, and after that it would start being first, second, third, fourth consumer after that. The other way we can categorize the parts is by just what kind of feeding it does. So you can see the phytoplankton are photosynthesizing, so more like plants, and zooplankton are more like animals, so they will eat the plants. After that, we've got carnivores that have to eat to sustain, actually zooplankton is also carnivore, eat others to get energy. Over here, we have plants eaten by a herbivore, and all of these are considered carnivores that would eat those other organisms. So lots of ways to classify the parts, and you have a picture like that in your notes that you can put classifications on. So you can see that the sun starts everything, and then it would be called first trophic level, where the producers are, and then primary, secondary, tertiary consumers. So a food web shows all energy transfers, and so in these food webs, sometimes it's showing you what other things can be eaten by that organism, and on many times, most of the time, an organism has many possible food sources. And like I was saying, when you see two organisms here and you're wondering which way it's going, always follow the arrow and say is eaten by. So the mouse is eaten by the duck. Okay. In terms of energy pyramids, only part of that energy can be transferred from one level to the next. In fact, the general rule of thumb is that it's actually only 10%, which some people find surprising. But basically, when you think of all the, let's say, food that, like maybe a moose that's eating grass, and something is going to eat that moose, let's say it's humans, there is a lot of that moose that is not eaten. So things like the hooves, the bones, the skin, the hair, organs that aren't eaten, intestines. And so when you're looking at all the food that all the producers that were eaten by that moose for that big animal, the amount that is actually consumable by the next level is quite small. A lot of the food that is eaten is also turned into body heat for that moose, so there's energy lost in the environment for body heat as well that's not even shown in our pyramid, but also for unusable and unedible parts that were still needing energy to build. So when you think of it that way, you can understand how of like the 1 million joules of sunlight, how it's only 10% of that 100,000 joules that is actually used by plants, but then it just keeps going by 10%. And so these grasshoppers only have 10,000 joules available to them, and these mice 1,000 joules available to them, and the snakes 100 joules available to them. So there's only 10% of the previous amount of at the previous level that's available to the next level. And so if you have a question about calculating the amount of energy available to the next level, you always go with the rule of 10 and say 10%, unless they tell you it's a little bit different than that, because questions may say in this pyramid it's 12% or 13% that's available to the next level, because of course the 10 is an average. But it is called the rule of 10. And so here is an example of beef that is only 10% of it is available to consumers to eat, and 10% of that cow, what it ate all the food for, is actually 90% of it is lost to the environment in heat and in unconsumable parts. The three kinds of pyramids that the other part of this topic is the energy pyramids. First of all is one called pyramid of numbers, and numbers is simply counting up in an area how much grass there would be. So 1.5 million here, and in that same spot how many mice it feeds. So 200,000 mice were fed out of that grass. The snakes, 90,000 snakes were able to eat the 200,000 mice, and that fed one hawk. So the in that area. So these pyramids are simply counting the numbers of organisms, and you can see that it is less and less as you go up in the food chain, and that means it's showing you that in fact there is less energy available to the next level as you go up. Sometimes we find there's an inverted pyramid of numbers, which sounds strange to begin with, but basically that is when you have a really big tree, and so that tree being so big, it can provide food for a whole bunch of insects. So the inverted pyramid of numbers is possible if that producer is very, very big. After that, it tends to stick with the pyramidal shape. The second kind of pyramid is a pyramid of biomass, and that is the dry mass of those organisms. So grams per square meters is the unit used for the dry mass. And so they take all the dry mass of everything alive in that area, see how many consumers can live off of that dry mass of them. And in the case of biomass, we again see that we have this pyramid getting smaller and smaller, less and less mass that it was used by the next level in the food chain. You will find the odd time there's an inverted pyramid of biomass, not very often, but in this one it says that in the oceans, in some aquatic ecosystems, the zooplankton that you know are the little animal ones that eat on the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton, a smaller amount can feed more zooplankton, and it says that the phytoplankton is eaten so quickly that this energy is able to be transferred, and so we get this strange inverted pyramid sometimes in the ocean for biomass. The last kind, the most common type of energy pyramid that you probably have heard of, that one we looked at before, is just joules of energy. And this one cannot be inverted. The amount of energy in total, this is not looking at biomass or numbers, it's looking at the amount of joules of energy, is going to be less to the next levels of the food chain. And it's generally, it says 10%, but could vary anywhere from 5 to 20% of energy that is available to the next level. And there is no inverted pyramid of energy for this kind of a pyramid. It will not be inverted. It will always be upright. Okay, this last thing is about biomagnification. You may have heard before is when toxic chemicals build up in the food chain and will get more concentrated as you go up the food chain. Things like DDT or mercury or lead that can collect in the brain or fat. Tissues of organisms is a big concern. You can read about the biomagnification little case study of DDT and how it was collecting in the eggshells of birds, and this was, I know, an issue with peregrine falcons and almost caused some extinction, but there was a big project done to preserve the birds that were affected by the DDT that were thinning their eggshells and could have eliminated those species. But basically what happens is that because the next level of the food chain, the squid eats so many of the zooplankton, it accumulates that in higher amounts in its body. And because the dolphin eats a lot of squid, it accumulates all the squid's chemicals in its body. So because they are not washed out or eliminated, those toxins tend to build up going higher as you go higher in the food chain. So in terms of eating, maybe if you're concerned about fish that has mercury buildup in it, the smaller the fish then, the less the mercury would be in its tissues. The larger the fish that you consume, the more of the biomagnification would cause more toxic chemicals in its built up in its body. Alrighty, that wraps up chapter 1 actually, and I'll see you back for chapter 2 very soon. Bye.